Who buys records anymore? Pfft, dorks. Welcome to Get Offset. My name is Emily, and I'm going to talk about something that I've definitely been thinking about a lot. And recently, I was in the Tone Mob group, and Blake Wyland asked, "Our album's dead," or something like that. And I think that's a very interesting thing to talk about that people have been talking about for like 21 years. I don't know when Napster come out, like 1999? Yeah. So let's have a bit of a history lesson, but first, let's talk about why people say album sales are declining. It's because they are, newsflash. It used to be, like, to be in the top 10 on Billboard, on the albums chart, you'd have to sell, like, 6 figures. And I remember, like, to be number one, there'd be, like, 2 albums that month that sold, like, that week, I mean, that, like, went on sale and sold 1 million copies, so only one of them could be number one. And this past year, one of my favorite bands, The Hold Steady, got in the top 10 in Billboard, moving 14,000 units in one day, in 1 week. Gosh, I'm doing great at remembering time frames. Yeah, so The Hold Steady, 14,000 copies in 1 week, that gets them in the top 10 of Billboard. That is something that has like not happened like 20 years ago. 20 years ago and before, never would have happened. Never, ever, not ever. But now it's what happens. But you see like stream counts, like people streaming single songs, and you see those hitting huge numbers, billions of streams on Spotify, and Spotify's been around since like, in America, since like 2012, 2011, probably like 2012. So, I mean, streaming is relatively new, but people were talking about albums being dead before streaming, so I think that's important to consider when you're talking about what killed albums. So yeah, we can confirm that album sales are down compared to like where they were in like the 90s, right? In the 90s, that was very much a heyday of album sales. And I think it's the that modern lens is making us feel like albums are dead and singles are taking over. And singles weren't a big deal in the 90s. Like, obviously, you'd have to release singles, you'd put out a video. So, yeah, I mean, they were a big deal, but people weren't buying singles. One, they didn't have a way to really buy a single. I mean, if you were a big fan of a band or performer, like, say, Fiona Apple, maybe you'd buy the CD single if you could find it, because they were hard to find. You had to go to a real record store, and they might have a copy. The only reason you get a CD single, because they're not smaller, they're not easier to transport, they're just a whole ass CD, can fit 80 minutes of music on it, and they put 2 to 3 songs on it. One of those songs is the single, the radio edit. Worst case scenario, the B-side is the album version. Best case scenario, the B-side is unreleased or a remix or something kind of cool. But not a lot of people did that. And you wouldn't do that just so that you could, like, I don't know, radio stations probably had them, DJs probably had them. But for the most part, your average consumer wasn't buying singles. We had to buy the whole album. And a ton of us got burned because the whole album wasn't very good. I think we've all been in that position where we're like, oh yeah, that single is great, but that album is trash. And I'm not going to be all like telling you my personal examples because it will get people mad at me, and I'm not gonna do that. So yeah, not give you one more reason to be mad at me. You have plenty. So I think that the fact that a lot of us grew up in this era, like, I'm 32, so like this is very true millennial to older millennial. Probably not so much younger millennials, definitely not Zoomers, but a lot of us grew up, or at least lived through this longer period of time where the whole album was king. And it was, great for record labels because they could charge 18 to 20 bucks for an album that they sold at FYE or Tower Records, and which everyone thought was a lot of money back then. And now, digital album copies are like 10 bucks. But I digress. So we grew up in this era where if you want to listen to the music like on your own in your home, the only format to do that was CDs. There was an overlap. So should we just talk about the history a little bit? Yeah, like, one last thing about the modern. We had to buy the whole CD. It cost you 20 bucks and you might not like any of the songs on it. So from a consumer standpoint, it wasn't a great shakeout, right? But let's talk about the history of recorded music. I'm excited. I majored in music business at Belmont University. I took a whole ass class called The History of Recorded Music, so I'm stoked to talk about it with you all right now. The original singles were sheet music. Hit would exist on the radio or just in popular culture. Something like Maresy Notes, Nosy Notes, and Little Lambs and Ivy, you could lead Ivy too, wouldn't you? That kind of stuff. You buy it, you take it home. Someone in your family would know how to play an instrument, hopefully, if not a couple, and that is how you play music. And some people had like player pianos, so you could buy the scroll because old school player pianos work just like an old music box where there's like a grid and it cranks and it makes the music happen. It's pretty neat. After that, we have the phonograph, famously invented by Edison. It was this little tube thing, and it worked just like a vinyl record. You would set a needle and it would go through the record like that. I say record, it was a recording for sure. These things were a pain in the ass to store. They would deteriorate. They weren't a forever medium. After that, so obviously like one song on a phonograph, like 3 minutes of music. Yeah, and that's it. And then after that, we move to shellac. If you have a modern turntable, you might see 3 speeds. You'll see 33, as in 33 and a third. That's the number of rotations per minute. These are all in rotations per minute. We have 70, the 7 inches. Gosh, I am just blanking on the speed of a 7-inch. And then you have another number on there. 7 inches are 45s. Good Lord, Emily, they're 45s. And then you might see I believe it's 78. I'm actually going to look that up. Shellac, RPM, 78s. So they were called 78s because it's 78 rotations per minute. And they're about 10 inches big. And they're made of a material called shellac. It was called shellac. So you either call them 78s or shellac. They'd have about 1, maybe 2 songs per side. They couldn't fit a ton of music on each side, even though that they're obviously have 3 more inches on them than 45s. They rotate about twice the speed of a 45, but they could fit less music on them, partially because of the speed. But here's a problem with shellac, is just like a brittle ceramic plate, you hit it on the side of a table, it shatters. It's not a robust medium, making it not ideal for collectors because it's fragile. Maybe it would exist in a jukebox or something. I'm not entirely sure if jukeboxes were really a thing. Certainly it'd be played on the radio, or you'd have a Victrola at your home and it would spit out the music in that big His Master's Voice cornucopia looking thing. And so that was how you could collect music. They weighed a ton, they took up a ton of space. Man, you think vinyl records take up a lot of space? At least you can fit like 30 to 45 minutes of music on a full length vinyl record instead of like 4 to 8 minutes per side or whatever shellac could accommodate. After that, so World War II happened, and there was a rubber shortage. So I believe it was I don't think it was invented in Athens, Ohio, but polyvinyl chloride started to be produced as an alternative to rubber. And it's also what is used on vinyl siding for houses. It's also what your lovely, beautiful vinyl records are made of. PVC. changed the history of recorded music. I wrote a whole ass paper about that in college. No one will ever read it, but I'm proud of it. So polyvinyl chloride, PVC, it's a little bit bendable, which means it's not going to break as easily, and you can make them lighter weight, and you can fit more music on each side. So that was really cool, but who's buying full-length albums? This didn't exist as the thing. You think about a collection of music outside of musicals and like operas and symphonies, this didn't exist. Bands would have large repertoires. Sure, a lot of what they knew would be covers. But what bands really focused on in recording were singles. The modern record industry is born from singles, and then those singles were sold primarily to jukeboxes. A man named Sam Goody comes along, buys the old records from the jukeboxes and starts selling them to consumers, makes the record companies really mad. He gets sued, he wins. That's why you can buy and sell used records. And if you're my age or older, you probably remember Sam Goody record stores. They still existed in the late 90s and early 2000s. So that Sam Goody was a real person, and you can thank him tremendously for your ability to buy and sell music as you want. Cool, right? So what would happen is a band would release singles, they put in enough singles, they could make an album. And then albums did start to gain popularity. One thing that's kind of interesting about albums is sometimes the single would be used to promote the album, and then completely different songs would exist on the album. And the reason artists had for doing this is because they didn't want to sell someone the same thing twice. And also if you got two things, you can sell people two things. If you only have one, and they thought, why would anybody buy the single when they could have it on the album? And back to the convenience of singles, yeah, 45s, a lot more convenient to carry around. If you've seen the movie Hairspray, you've seen Amanda Bynes' character carrying around her little container of 45s. I have a couple of those storage containers. They're pretty cute. But I mean, you couldn't carry all that around very well. And if you listen to 45s, again, great for DJs and stuff, people spinning music, great for jukeboxes, great for listening to the favorite song over and over. But you could get through more music on an album and you wouldn't have to flip it. It didn't require as much active listening. So that format gained popularity, but singles never went away, right? Obviously, you can buy singles from literally every decade of recorded music. Even in the 90s, there were some 7 inches that were sold. But you look into the 80s, you'd even find the 12-inch dance remixes. Prince did tons of special 12-inch remixes of his songs. Keep people dancing to his songs longer on the dance floor was kind of the idea, and it worked. It did. And then we also have, in that time frame, we have cassette tapes become popular. Cassette singles never really took off in the same way that CD singles never took off. There's really no benefit of them. They were the same size, just less stuff, and also you still had to pay more money for them. And then you had 8 tracks, which you could actually play in your car, which was pretty cool. But those were pretty short-lived mediums. Basically, 8 tracks were killed by cassettes, cassettes were killed by CDs, and then vinyl was killed by CDs. Because vinyl could degrade, it could melt, it could become damaged, and CDs had a higher quality of fidelity. After digital recording, that was the idea. So now we're into the 90s. In the 90s, record labels really had a hold on how people purchase music. You had to buy CDs, and you had to buy the full length of the CDs unless you could find the CD single and blah, 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 blah. The only alternative you had back then was if you still had a cassette player that could record and a turntable and or a radio. You could make that's how people used to make mixtapes. They would take their turntable, record a song to the mixtape. So it was something that you were doing live. And if you wanted to steal music back then, you had to listen to the radio, wait for your song to come on, and hit record really quickly. And you'd probably lose the first bit, and then the DJ would talk over the end, and it would just, it sucked. So that, that was the experience of singles for a very long time. All right, so now let's talk about the modern era. We've talked before about how Napster came along and offered something called peer-to-peer sharing. The idea was you would connect your computer to another computer, and you could have whatever music that they put up into the ether. It's called torrenting, and it still exists. But it doesn't really exist for music anymore. And that's largely because of Spotify, but I don't want to get there quite yet because there was such a long period between Napster launching and Spotify launching, and a lot happened in between that. So let's talk about it. Napster launches in the late 90s, early 2000s. Record companies say, "Bah," at first, and then they realize people are stealing from them, and they lose their shit and start suing fans. Great PR, just mwah, beautiful. Made people really feel bad for these record companies that have been charging them $18 to $20, and essentially a lot of record companies would also do basically price fixing. They would one thing they would do is they would pay for ads and like print publications for some very friendly record shops. So when these labels wanted to promote their bands and those records, they would work with the record shops and be like, make sure it says, find it at FYE and find it at Tower Records. But what the record shops had to do is charge more for the record. And then you had people like Best Buy, companies like Best Buy, corporations of people. Companies like Best Buy would charge $10 for a CD the day it came out as a loss leader to bring people into the store to buy, hopefully, appliances. Because that's where they made most of the money. And appliances are recession-proof. Another digression there. People are always going to need a dishwasher when the dishwasher breaks. Yeah, so we have people noticing that CDs are quite expensive and often had thin kind of quality. Of course, there were some masterpieces that came out. There's so many albums that were popular that had all killer, no filler. Unfortunately, there were a lot of albums that were just really, really bad. And people were getting really tired of it. They had no way to really, unless there was like a listening station, try it before they bought it. Sometimes, you can go off of reviews, but, unless you really agree with the critics at Rolling Stone all the time, and who does? Yeah, you see where I'm going. And then after that, some companies started to create alternatives to Napster. And what these alternatives sought to do was make people pay for music again. To put it lightly, there were a lot of problems with these platforms. Some of them only had stuff from certain labels. It wasn't really centralized. You had to go to a bunch of different places to get a bunch of different things. And then iTunes comes along. Was iTunes ever the best when it came to buying, storing, and ripping and putting your music on your different devices? Were they ever the best for that? Absolutely not. They were always bad. iTunes was always bad. Let's not pretend that iTunes wasn't always just awful, but they were one of the first. And they were one of the first companies to really put a lot of money behind this big home base for your entertainment needs. Because pretty quickly it wasn't just songs, it was videos. Podcasts weren't quite a thing yet, but audiobooks always were a thing. There were always books on tape and CD and stuff like that. So they kind of won. And they got to choose their pricing structure. So they decided to charge 99 cents per song or $10 per album. And if I remember correctly, not all albums let you download singles or just specific songs, but a lot of them did. And one cool thing that they did was, you ever rent a movie on iTunes and then you think, oh man, I would really love to buy that. But then the rental fee doesn't also count toward if you wanted to buy it full out. So you think to yourself, oh, I could pay $6 to rent it right now, or I could just buy it for forever for $12 or whatever. Yeah, you can't do that with movies. You could almost always do it, from what I remember, with digital albums. So you could try it before you bought it. You can even listen to a preview of every song from the comfort of your own home you can see how this is appealing to people, right? Like, let's be honest, like there are people who've always listened to the whole CD. I'm guilty of it too. I love albums, but even on albums I love, I'll be like, listen to that same song over and over, over and over, hit back, 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 back. Like there are songs where I can't listen to them just one time. And then sometimes it takes me like a week and a half to get through a record, because by the time I get to the second song, then I want to hear the second song again and again and again. You know, it's vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. But with iTunes, you could just download the songs that you knew you liked. And you would know that if I decide to buy the rest, I can complete the album, and it's going to take into account that I already bought one of the songs. So even if the album had 15 songs, which does happen, which is like kind of bananas, and you really, it's too much. It's too much songs unless you are guided by voices. Then like 15 songs wasn't $15. 15 songs was $10 with exceptions. Don't tell me there were exceptions. I know there were exceptions. It is okay. It is fine. I'm talking in broad strokes here. So yeah, you can't really blame people for looking at their free alt weekly and seeing that they could go to FYE to buy the new Blur record, or they could download it for literally half the price, not have to go to the mall. And you know what? They could just download the Blur songs they wanted to listen to. Fantastic. You cannot blame consumers for wanting to do that. The thing is, you can't blame consumers for any of this stuff, really, because we were so abused for so long. We truly were, albeit not as abused as the artists. So when you look at that, and that trend is just continued through the decades, even looking at it back then, I mean, there are obviously reasons why bands should put out full-length records. I feel like I've talked about that before, but you know, one of the reasons is that it's a lot harder to get press as an independent artist from a single. It's possible and it happens, obviously, but doing things like touring, getting a lot of press behind a single, that's a lot harder than an entire record. So that's one of the reasons it's still important for bands to create records. And you know, as far as like consumption goes, I think it exists kind of like on an inverse bell curve, where over here you have indie bands. Indie bands can release an album, people are probably going to buy the whole album and not the single. Over here you have Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and Adele. People will buy the whole album. Of course, a lot of people will buy singles, but tons of people are buying the whole album. And then in the middle, you have a lot of bands who have a hit song, who, you know, probably still sell a lot of copies of the record, but most people buying the singles because it's a lot like indie bands you can support. You want to support them. You probably aren't hearing their singles on the radio. Big acts, you know that every single song on that Adele record is going to make you cry and hurt you in a very good way. And then in the middle, it's stuff you can't commit to as much because you're not as familiar with it, and because you've heard the single. I've never bought a Bruno Mars record. Sure, I bought Bruno Mars singles, probably a bad example. Listen, Uptown Funk is a great song. I don't care what any of you think. Yeah, so it's kind of like the bell curve of popularity. You know, and we already talked about how some album sales were saved because iTunes would let you complete the album. And then we have streaming. All right, let me talk a little bit about CDs too, because we talk about peer-to-peer killing the record industry. A big part of that was also what they called borrow to burn. And that is when one person in your friend group would buy the CD and the rest of you would rip it to your computer, or you get a burned copy. So you could still listen to that as much as you wanted, and you didn't have to pay for it. One person pays for it, and then 10 people will do it. Even people who aren't tech savvy could do this, and you could make awesome playlists, and you'd have to make them in real time. Like it used to be, you'd be listening to the playlist as you were making it. Now you can just rattle them off, and you can do it in an afternoon, like in an hour after school, like, and then you could return the CD to your friend the next day. Spotify killed both of those things. Just killed them. Spotify did effectively kill peer-to-peer, which is what the music industry wanted to happen. However, it wasn't really replaced by a medium that was super conducive to artists making money. And there are a couple reasons artists don't make money on streaming. It used to be in record labels, streaming was such a minute part of your deal that you as a musician just wouldn't ask for a better split on it. You'd be like, oh, I'd rather have the CD, like, I'd rather make 95 cents per album sold, which was a lot, than like get a little bit of this other revenue, which is why I think the 90s were probably the worst time to sign a record deal, but I digress. Again, and that's like my third digression. Whoops. So Spotify, there was a free version, still is, hooks a lot of people in. How do artists get paid from those free listens? Ads. Okay. Sounds expensive. It's actually really, really cheap to run a Spotify ad campaign. Your minimum is $200. It's really, really cheap. It's also not particularly effective. And then you have people who pay like, I think the average is like $10 for like a premium subscription or something like that. I don't know the exact numbers, but you can buy so you talked about iTunes, you can buy a record on iTunes for $10. Or you could have access to almost all of humanity's known recorded music for $10 a month. You can't blame the consumers for making the decision the consumers are going to make, the decision that is best for them. You can educate people to explain to them why they should support music, but most people don't notice music until it's gone. You ever go to a restaurant and you're hanging out and you're having a good time, and then you stop and you're like, why is the vibe suddenly so weird? And you realize it's because the music stopped. A world without music is really terrible. It's hard to convince people of that. So, yeah, musicians don't get paid for the streams because of record label contracts and because Spotify doesn't really pay that much per stream. Fun fact, Napster pays more per stream than Spotify. Yes, Napster still exists. It does not resemble old Napster at all, but it still exists, and it pays artists a penny per stream. That's 0.7 cents more than Spotify pays per stream. You know, the bar is in hell, but it still exists. Great. Great. So, what's killing albums? What's killing albums? I think primarily it's the ease of buying singles. I mean, you can actually buy a single for 99 cents, and that's bananas. I don't really know exactly how much 45s used to cost, but if they cost $0.25 in 1960, that'd be $2.25 now. So already, a downloaded song is between 99 cents and $1.29. Regardless, that's at least $1 off of what it should be if singles were 45s in 1960 were 25 cents. A record that was monophonic in mono would have been $2 in 1960. That's $18 now. So actually, and then like think an album in stereo would have been twice that. So like $36. So when FYE was charging $18 in 1999 for that Blur CD, they were actually more in line with inflation then than we are now. And you wonder why musicians don't have any money. Not that musicians were always getting all of that $18. Usually they were not. But still, it's wild that we've basically devalued music by refusing to allow it to keep up with inflation. Even since 2001 or whatever. In 20 years, the cost of buying a single has not changed a penny. Not at all. How is that possible? I'm not saying like I would be happy if prices increase for music, because then obviously like my costs for music to consume it are going to increase. But it's wild that, like, minimum wage has barely kept up with inflation since then better than recorded music, than singles. And I think it just really goes to show that labels seem to consider recorded music as a loss leader. Like Best Buy would use recorded music to get people to go in and buy appliances. It's like record labels are taking recorded music, and places like iTunes are taking recorded music and using it as a loss leader to see the tour, to buy merch, to get it in movies, which has a larger payout for synchronization. That's another reason albums just aren't taking off, is because the promotion machine doesn't really care what it is as long as it's enough to get out there. Again, the only reason I see to really release a full record like every couple years than to do a single every couple months is because you need something to tour behind. And if you're a pop star who does, like, I don't know about the touring aspect, but I don't know. Pop stars come out with records. They also come out with singles. All these people still have albums. You know, the biggest pop stars in the world, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Adele, they still do albums. So I don't really know why people are saying that album as an art format, I don't think is going to die, because I think people like to create them. I think that unless the way that PR and the promotion machine works changes to the point where, like, you don't have to have an album out to headline a tour, maybe people don't spend all the money to create an album and to print an album. The biggest physical sales right now are vinyl records, and there's like an 8-month lead time on, like, pressing those. That's like doubled. It's doubled since COVID, basically. I think it used to be like 4 months. Now it's 6 to 8 months, and some places just aren't accepting new acts. They aren't, like, the record pressing plants are turning people away because they can't fulfill it, or they'd rather save that space for the bigger performers. So yeah, maybe that's another reason. It's just so expensive to create, to spend multiple days in the studio, to mix and master 10 to 12 songs. Like, if you're smart, mix to master 14 to 16 songs so you have some B-sides and unreleased stuff. To create physical copies of this. Distribution's cheap. Go to distrokid.com/VIP/get offset to save 7% on your annual DistroKid membership. And you know, it's and then you have to hire a publicity company that costs hundreds of dollars a month on the low end. Like, it's a lot of expense. So you can kind of understand the appeal of just throwing singles out there, seeing what sticks, and then if something sticks, creating an album based on that sound might be the smarter way to go, because you can be nimble on singles. You can change your entire sound between singles. The band Striking Matches one year did 3 EPs in 3 different genres. I don't know if they were just, like, throwing it out there to see what stuck and what really resonated with people more, but that is a tactic you could do to, you know, try to increase your odds of success, of connecting with people. Because you can fake a lot in this industry. You can fake how well you sing. You can fake how well you write. You cannot fake whether or not what you're creating is connecting with people. I've said that before. I'll say it again. You can put it on my gravestone. You can. All right. You know, and the last thing I want to say is there are a lot of music fans who just don't care about albums. That's fine. But there are a lot of people who really love them. And I do believe that as long as people love and care about albums, artists will continue to make them and not just singles. But I don't know if it's necessarily something that we should be having a panic about as far as the state of albums versus the state of singles. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because the music industry was always born of singles. Again, and I just really want to send this home, full lengths are relatively modern. I mean, if you look at the history of recorded music, albums have existed since, you know, the beginning of it, but the popularity of them, I think, really, really kicked off in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So maybe it's cyclical. I really don't know. I'm not I think Niels Bohr said prediction is very difficult, especially of the future. And it's hard to argue with a physicist like that. I think he was a physicist. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that quote was in the graduation speech I gave in high school. But, in albums also, they can take it out of people. You look at people like Jimi Hendrix, who did an album every year. He got so burned out, and, he died really young. And then you have, people who just live off of making albums like Prince. And that's what they love to do. And you have people who make albums and didn't want to tour, like Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson made so much per record that he didn't need to tour. He only toured when he needed money. So, musicians are going to create the way they want to create. And consumers are going to consume the way they want to consume. And I would love to see more people invest in music and support bands. I personally think that, the last thing I need in the world is another t-shirt, but I bought one from my local record store, Sonic Boom, for Record Store Day. Actually, that makes this very, very timely. Record Store Day is another thing. It's like albums. It's a lot of albums, but it's also a lot of singles. And sometimes I think the singles are more exciting. And how much do they charge for these vinyl singles? Like $7, $8, $12. Keeping up with inflation a little bit better so that the artists can get more money in their pockets. I love it. Well, I'm sorry that this was such a long spiel, but thank you for watching. Thanks for understanding. Please like, comment, subscribe below. Tell me your thoughts about albums versus singles and why you think that albums are declining, or even if you do think they're declining. Actually, a lot of albums get released every year. Tons. Literally more than can be listened to. So, check out my music at emilyfuckingharris.com. Bye.